So I'm going to call to order the City of Burlington Board of Finance meeting on Monday, March 23rd, 2026 at 4:33 p.m. Our first item is the agenda. Is there a motion on the agenda?
Move to adopt the agenda.
Moved by Councilor Barlow. Is there a second? Seconded by Councilor Carpenter. Thank you. Any discussion on the agenda before we vote? Seeing none. Actually, Catherine, are there any councilors online? So I keep it on.
No, not yet.
Not yet. Okay, but we do have quorum. All right, so all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Our next item is public forum. This is practice of the Board of Finance. That's a different view today. Which is fine. It's more helpful, which is great. So it's a practice of the Board of Finance to do public forum first with members of the public in the room first, and then we go online. So if you have for people, we try to limit to a couple minutes each person per city council rule. So I am not seeing anyone except for staff in the room. Okay. Except as I say, don't make eye contact. Usually they don't make eye contact. That's it. So we'll go online instead, and I see former City Councilor Sharon Busher. Sharon, welcome. Go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. So I have two general questions. One has to do with the College Street item and the ARPA funding that will be spent. It's anticipated around $200,000, and there's a sunset for that funding. I guess we got about, based on that communication, thank you, that was helpful, 3.29 million in 2023. But I wasn't quite sure if this suggested that there may be some unspent ARPA funds. And I think that would be really important to know. I hope that doesn't turn out to be the case, but I really couldn't pluck that out of that communication. And so it's peripheral to this specific one, but it's still relevant. The second thing has to do with the consent item with the two TIFs, the the downtown and the waterfront. And I wondered if there was an agenda item coming up for the Board of Finance that would be a little more in depth about, how we're tracking, we're borrowing dollars, and how are we doing with generating money to repay? I think that this is a form that goes to the state. It had some information at the very top, but as far as where we were and how much now debt we've accrued, but it didn't really answer these questions. And I think that I really feel like as a resident, I'd like to understand how we're doing with those funds. And I'd appreciate that in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Is anyone else online who'd like to address the Board of Finance? Not seeing anyone else, then I will close the public forum. We'll move on to our next item, which is the consent agenda. Is there a motion on the consent agenda?
Adopt the consent agenda.
Moved by Councilor Travers. Is there a second? Seconded by Councilor Carpenter. Thank you. Any discussion before we vote? Seeing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Adopted our consent agenda. Now to our first item, which is item 4, which is a presentation of our forward one. Is a presentation of our fiscal year 27 general fund budget presentation. And we're actually going to largely focus on discussing with the board and the public, of course, the general fund budget gap and our analysis as a team. And so CEO Sean, maybe some our data team, data analyst will be leading us through, and I'll type in a little bit here and there. So which one of you is starting? Nancy. Ready to start, Nancy?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good for being here.
First. So I'm going to share with you all some work we've been doing, looking at the general fund budget gap, the persistent budget gap we're facing, looking at both what has caused it, and then also trying to project forward and see what we expect to come based on the historic patterns we've seen. So the first slide I have is on the use of one-time funds. So this is common commonly cited reason for the budget gap that we've seen. And you can see from this data that over the past 10 years, there was a real ramping up of the use of these one-time funds. They're split across a few different categories, including those, the orange is the federal funds that we received. And these have created a situation where they've filled in the gap that we saw over these years, and they're now tapering off. But these one-time funds are not the only reason for the budget gap. So for this presentation, what I did was I looked at both expense categories and revenue categories to see how they've been growing over the past 10 years and how that shows, how that creates a budget gap over time. So next slide looks at how expenses are split across our general fund. This breaks it down into 4 categories, with personnel being the largest, and personnel usually makes up just about 60% over all these years. The next largest is general operating, which is sort of a catch-all for other types of expenses. Oh, and I should say personnel includes both salaries and wages, benefits, overtime, and a few other sort of related personnel costs. And there's debt service and then interfund, which are transfers to other funds. This is to show just like the magnitude of the different expense groups. And then the next slide shows how some of these expense categories have changed over time. So this chart looks at the percentage change since 2017. There's also a line here that shows the general inflation as well. So you can see that all 3 of these categories have grown faster than inflation since 2017. Health insurance here is a subset of personnel costs, and that particularly over the past couple of years has grown even faster than personnel costs, and personnel costs faster than general operating. On the revenue side, the next chart does the same as expenses and breaks down how revenue has changed, or breaks down how the general fund is made up of these different revenue sources. Here again, property tax is by far the largest category, but it's not even quite half of the general fund. We also have direct revenues, which are most generally they're anything the city sells. So they include everything from campsites to building permits, cycling fees, those are some of the larger ones, parks, camps, etc. Then there's pilot, the sort of sales tax, local option and gross receipts, and then a few other miscellaneous categories that are revenue pass-throughs, which are similar to the expense interfund. So you can see how the general fund is sort of predominantly property tax, but not exclusively. The next slide looks at how these categories have changed over time, with property taxes growing fastest, and then pilot and direct revenues growing even slower than inflation. Gross receipts has nearly grown as fast as property tax, but that's largely because of the rate change. It's between FY 24 and 25. So that sort of bumped it up to closer to where property taxes are. When you put all these categories onto one slide, onto one chart together, what you see, or what I see, is how the sort of 2 largest categories on either side, that property tax and personnel costs, have moved together, which makes sense because they are the largest part of each side of that budget. But there's not many other major revenue sources that have kept up with the personnel cost increase, again, except for gross receipts with that recent increase in the rate. So that shows generally how these categories have changed over time. And so what I did next was I took these rates of growth and projected them forward into time to see how we expect the budget to grow if these past trends continue. So the next chart is a bit dry, but I wanted to be very transparent with what I did with the following models that I projected out. So this shows the budget totals, how much each of these categories makes up of the general fund, how much they've grown on average each year, and then how I modeled them into the future. So for most of these, the model matches the growth from at the past 10 years, with a few exceptions. So interfund and revenue pass-throughs I set to match property tax growth, because these are largely property tax transfers. And then the debt service line is set to match the actual cost that we expect to pay. And then property tax is the most complicated one. So for the property tax, I set the grand list to grow at 0.8%, which matches past growth. Retirement to grow at 5% and debt service at the expected cost, and set the tax rate to match, or the tax rate to cover that increase in debt service and retirement, but then otherwise the discretionary rate stayed flat. So using those assumptions, when you map that out onto future years, what you see is this fairly familiar chart of revenues just not keeping up with the growth in expenses. If you look out, this ends up being like quite a large budget gap, which we never will actually get to, but you can see there's just a widening gap over every year as expenses continue to just grow faster than the revenue categories. If you adjust for this, this model here is keeping property taxes to grow very slowly. Again, they're just growing to cover debt and retirement. So if the next slide shows some scenarios where we do increase what I'm calling the discretionary tax rate, so the other tax rates beyond debt service and retirement, either some small amount like a 2% growth or a 6% property tax growth is in line with what we've seen in the past. So if you set property taxes to grow at 6% each year, as you'd expect, because we balance the budgets every year, and so if property taxes continue to grow at 6%, it does end up matching expenses. But even then, there's still a gap, and does not result in sort of surplus revenue, even at a high rate of growth. So the final slide I did was me trying to find a little optimism in this work and think about what could be possible. What ways can we set these growth rates to work where the budget would balance in the future? I want to stress that one, this is it's just one scenario. You could set these numbers in any certain way and get them, but it happens to work with these. And I'll also say, like, these are just numbers I came up with that happened to work, that I felt was somewhat reasonable. But this it's not a target, it's just one sort of scenario that could work in the future. And I would say the key parts of this model here is that while property taxes are held down, and they do increase somewhat, and in order to make that work, you have to reduce the rate of growth on personnel. This model also increases the direct revenue growth quite a bit. So those are all the slides for the main part of the presentation. If anyone has questions.
Just gonna add a couple of quick things, and we can leave this slide up. And I know counselors know this, but for the sake of the many people in public watching this presentation right now, I want to make sure that with the historic numbers that you see on the historic side of this particular chart from 2024, 2025, and then what we're projecting to do here in 2026, it looks like there was no gap. And that is because we are required under charter to pass a balanced budget, of course. And despite my plea to Nancy, it's very complicated to try to model that to show like before and after. But part of what I am proud to say, and it's been very hard work by the city and by partnering with the council, is that we collectively closed the gap each of those 3 years, which would have made the budget gap much wider in those previous slides if we hadn't started to take some action on some balanced approaches in these last 2 fiscal years that we've passed together and put those budgets in place, and then the work we're underway right now for fiscal year 27. So that is it's a little. I just want to make sure that's said for the sake of the record. The other thing about this optimistic target, which I think is a reflection of, again, our collective work and the budget that I'm preparing with my team here for fiscal year 27, all the assumptions that Nancy has here are doable, but they also show a continuation of a balanced approach that's not over reliant on any particular assumption here. This includes, for example, not being overzealous in our assumptions of what we could do immediately on our grant list, which is a hard thing to get moving in an upward direction in terms of growth. But as we get the housing strategy implemented and moving, we can start to have some, I think, realistic assumptions around some intentional growth there. But not assuming we're going to jump to 2% overnight, because that would be an overpromise and an overassumption in what we can do. And the same can apply to a lot of these other aspects of the assumptions here in terms of how the tax rate growth might be. There's a lot of unknowns in those many years ahead that can happen on the federal level, even on the state level. And I know the state, for example, is facing some very hard budgeting years this year, and next year will be even harder for the state. So it is unknown about how that, we're sort of on the receiving end of what the feds and the state decide to do or not do in terms of what we have to do as a local community to maintain what we prioritize, et cetera. But the main takeaway I hope people take, as Nancy was saying, I just want to underscore, is that we have some experience balancing these budgets in balanced ways. We're going to apply that into the future going forward. So while we have not solved the budget gap, I just want to make sure that's clear too. This is an optimistic target. There's a lot of assumptions behind that. I don't want people to be surprised that we're still talking about a structural budget gap in fiscal year 28 or fiscal year 29. We are narrowing it, and it is based on some really hard work that we're diligently trying to do in a balanced way. And I hope that we can work again together, council and mayor, to make all of these balanced assumptions actually feasible and can actually close up this gap, or make it so small that it's not so sizable, or seismic is probably the word, for what the city experiences, at least in the last couple of years here, as the one-time funds have dried up and some other factors have impacted our local economy. Thank you for letting me insert myself. You can see. Catherine, do you have anything to add either before we open up questions?
No.
Great. Back to Nancy and being in charge. Questions or discussion? Yeah. Councilor Travis?
Yeah. Thank you, Nancy. This is a great presentation, as always. I have a couple specific questions for you, and then maybe we'll have some broader general thoughts. One is, maybe this is not a tonight thing, but I think in terms of even further breaking it down from what we've seen here, I would be curious in knowing exactly what is driving the increase in the city's debt service obligations. I think that there's some confusion at the public level as well around what aspect of that is driven or not driven, I should say, by the high school and tech center. What aspect of it is driven by recent bond measures? From my perspective, that is one of the more significant increases in recent budgets that have driven the gap and have driven higher property taxes. So the ability to further break that down, and I think as well, if we're able to project out over multiple years, when we know what our debt obligations are, and as we look towards 2027, 2028 and beyond, is that going to continue to grow? Has it plateaued? If we were to add on another bond measure, you know, what something like that would mean. So I think that would be helpful from my perspective. The other sort of discrete question that I have is it's with respect to the appendices, and it appears back in 2022 that there was a pretty significant drop in revenue collected from the police department, fees for service and parking permits, etc. in particular. I'm just curious if you have any additional information with respect to what drove that decrease.
The parking permits, I believe, is because they moved to DPW. Yes, so that revenue. The fees for service, I'm less sure about.
Okay. It's interesting to me because the chart makes it appear as if there was $1 million loss in revenue for the police department. I don't necessarily see where that's otherwise made up in the chart. There's DPW recycling fees line, which makes sense, but I don't see a DPW parking line, which maybe it's under all other direct revenue. I don't know, but I think that would be helpful to know.
I can.
So those were the two specific questions that I have, and it's the projections around debt service and understanding exactly what that makes up. That would be, I think, most helpful from my perspective, because look, ultimately, whether voters knew it or not, right? I do think that as voters have engaged with these really big infrastructure projects with significant, you know, 8-figure, 9-figure price tags attached to them. Voters have been making choices, right, with respect to where the city's priority lies. I do think that in pushing some of these larger projects, it seems to be ballooning the debt service obligation. That there may need to, from my perspective, be further trade-offs in the general operating expenses of the budget.
I don't have an immediate answer for you on that, but it's working on it fast. And
Thank you.
Other questions or comments from? Mr. Burlington.
And I know this is all, I also thank you for this great presentation, and this, I like the way it encapsulates the drivers of the budget gap. I have a question about the optimistic targets, I guess, on the grant list. Like, the grant list, historic growth has been at 0.8%. We know we had some years where it was higher, and it seems like now things are under pressure a little bit. It feels that way anyways. We see the market with the houses and people reducing prices and whatnot. I'm just wondering if, like, how would we, like, what are some strategies that we would get it back up to 1%? Would it be, maybe this is beyond data analysis and more in the policy question, but that seems to be like, yeah, the model is, you know, that this is how we could achieve these things. But I was curious if there's any thinking. I know Nancy said these were sort of these were numbers that got us to this sort of equilibrium of expense and growth and got rid of the gap. But I'm wondering if there's any additional thinking that's going on. So the other one that I'm wondering about is the personnel line, because we've seen your earlier charts how like healthcare costs have been really accelerating almost, and with some of the federal action, I don't see that abating anytime soon. And we know that a lot of our personnel costs are driven by bargaining strike with various unions, so that also seems to be, maybe it is an optimistic target that we could bend that without actually reducing the size. So I know maybe it's more commentary than it is questions, but I don't know if there was any additional reasoning that could be offered around how the model operates. Not to the,
I was gonna invite up our CEDO director, and
Yes.
is also lighting as the chief of staff right now. And I was just gonna say, one of the things that, and Nancy, I'll let you go first, and then to Cara, I'll go first, Mr. Mayor, if you don't mind, is one of the things that, as I mentioned briefly before about the housing strategy that I've asked the team to start thinking about is how do we specifically break down housing projections as it overlays with all of these components, including realistic ones that can really create some numbers and some goals really year by year in terms of how to accelerate housing growth, but also democratize how it is. We're not waiting on just a couple of large projects to come online. Also, when do some of these big projects that are eventually taxable, but not right now for local revenue purposes, come online? It's there, and it sends a little bit of a shiver up my spine. It's 2035. So that's out there. And so, but these are, again, back to policy decisions made by the city in the past that do impact revenue coming online. All of these different moves, though, on their own are not necessarily highly impactful on our assumptions here for how the grant list will grow. So we have a large, pool of what's taxable in the city. And we know that a part of this can be accelerated if we have a smart strategy that's built out based on our housing strategy. And that'll go to Nancy first, and then Cart probably build from there.
I'll just say the way the math works out, this was actually surprising to me. The increase in the grant list was not as impactful to the budget gap as I would have thought, because it's such small increments of, like 0.1%, we're trying to get it up. So until you get to like a much higher grant list growth, it doesn't do much to like really bend that revenue curve up. Which I was surprised about doing this work. Not to say that we want to grow the grant list for all sorts of reasons, but it's not gonna, you know, at 0.8% or 1.2%, it's not gonna be the difference of this gap.
And the mayor did sort of encapsulate what we're working on. CEDO and planning are, because of the build resolution, are coming to give a full housing update. It got taken off today's agenda for obvious reasons, so we'll be coming on April 13th to give you sort of a more meatier policy plan to try and get those numbers up, in addition to TIF. The waterfront TIF with the north and south tower of City Place will I think be quite impactful on our grand list, but those won't come online for our grand list until 2035. So we still have 9 years there.
I don't know if you wanted to respond to the personnel.
Oh,
Costs.
sorry, Mark, can you say that part again? So could you repeat your question again, or your comment about personnel? Sorry,
I'm sorry, I just said that, the driving that, bending that.
Yeah.
Expense curve.
Yeah.
Seemed to also be, like, it says optimistic targets, and seemed there was optimism there. I know that we were more strained on personnel costs, you know, because of our bargaining agreements, and because of the cost of healthcare, that we don't really have any ability to affect. The only thing we can affect is the number of employees. Seems like those increases are hard to change. Be regular.
Right, I would tend to agree. I think part of this is something that we have to just keep front of mind as we bargain with our unions in a fair way, of course, but also looking at affordability for the city and comparable agreements. We tend to be some of the more generous contracts, which I think is an important part. But we have to really be landing in places that we can sustain and work together to figure out other things within the contract perhaps we could pay more attention to than just the actual personnel cost overall. And you've heard me say this multiple times before, I think we just need to collectively really push the state or wherever we can on the health insurance matter, because the numbers alone in the earlier chart from Nancy should tell a very stark reality for every large employer, every employer period, of how completely unsustainable that is. And it's really not only can individuals probably in the city not we find affordable health insurance themselves as individuals, families, but we now as taxpayers are also sort of burdened with that same reality, trying to make sure that we offer decent benefits for our employees. I'm largely disagreeing with you, Mark, and Councilor Barlow, and I think this is the work ahead as we figure out what's the right approach in a way that also doesn't undervalue or switch in the wrong direction around undercompensating our hardworking city employees. Yeah, thank you. A couple more minutes on this item before we move on. Any other comments? This is a discussion only item. So anything else?
Well, just sort of question, I mean, two big users of our general fund are parks and city arts. And they're very few revenue as well. I'm just wondering how far down we dig in terms of what personnel make money for us as opposed to those that don't. And I just think that's something that policy wise is maybe important for us to look at. You know, there's some of those activities we may not be able to afford if we're quote subsidizing. And I know they're users of personnel, and a lot of that personnel is temporary, but nonetheless, it's in that number. So I just think that would be important for us to analyze.
Thank you, Councilor Carpenter. I think one of the things we are working on even in fiscal year 27's budget is really encouraging all of our departments that can't do charge for fees and services for the different programs to really continue to build what has been 2 years worth of work around what are the competitive fees we can charge for the city. How do we keep in mind, of course, equity for access to programming and services people will have ability to pay, but also keep in mind of what we can sustain. And maybe we have to be right sizing what we offer in order to make it all work at the end of the day. So I look forward to digging into that a little more when we start to.
I think it'll be important, and part of it might be spinning off some of the stuff in a sense. Are there other providers in the community, I mean, not for critical city services, but for some of the others?
And so we'll start budget presentations at the end of April, and that has been the ask to all departments is to really get very clear about essential and core services, especially those offering outward facing programming, about is it essential and critical that we offer this because no one else does, and if so, why? So that we really present a budget that's clear about why the city is the lead in any of those health offerings. Anything else for Nancy or we move on? Okay, with that, Nancy, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Move on to our deliberative agenda now, item 5.1, which is the sheet come on up. This is 5.1 is the advanced life support intercepts.
So the fire department occasionally provides ALS intercepts to outside agencies when a higher level care is needed. What that means, like for example, Colchester Rescue doesn't have a paramedic or an AEMT working. And they call for us to provide an AEMT or paramedic, provide those life-saving skills. Currently, we don't bill for that process. There is an agreement in District 3, which is the district Burlington's a part of. And it's a standard $350 reimbursement per intercept. We can't bill the patient because that's double billing. The transporting agency is the one that bills, but we are allowed to bill the EMS organization. So that's what we are looking to do, is to bill the other agencies along with the District 3 intercept rate of $350.
That efficient, appreciate it. Questions or comments on the board?
Curious why this has to come to us and why it was going on. Bill them whenever you can.
I think because we've never billed before.
I'm just curious, but
Versus just. The attorney is, yeah, answer short.
Yeah. Counselor Carpenter, I'm gonna speak to our BFD attorney, which is Attorney McLennan.
it's not urgent, I just was.
Get back to you on that.
Okay, great, thank you, City Attorney Brown.
Yeah.
Other questions or comments on this item? Councilor Rose.
Just a very brief question. So have we been providing ALS services at no charge?
Yes.
This is an example of mutual aid.
To a
Some
degree,
extent.
yeah, to a degree, because these agencies, like again, it's a District 3 agreement. If we had called for a paramedic, they would bill us. So this is just the same thing. When they call for us, we bill them. We haven't had to. We're fortunate that we have paramedics on staff every day, multiple. So we're never into that situation, but it'd be the same sort of.
Anything else on this item before I don't see there's a question? Is there a motion?
So
So Councilor Carpenter moves the motion on civic clerk. Is there a second? Seconded by Councilor Barlow. Any further discussion on this before we vote? Seeing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye. Any opposed, nay. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Moving on to item 5.2, which is with our Burlington Parks Recreation and Waterfront Department, a request for the creation of a position and a job description for the Department of Parks, Recreation and Water. Anything here officially before?
I have not officially presented. I've been to several
Well, welcome.
meetings. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time. Today I'm asking for full creation of a recreation manager for Letty and the citywide sports divisions. The purpose of this request is that when I came into my position, I started initially having conversations with staff and with our labor partners around kind of the organizational setup of the department as a whole. As you're aware, we went through several cuts in the last budget cycle as it related to both the Modern Gov initiative and the structural funding gaps that are present in the city budget. And with that, recognized that we needed to have direct reporting structures in kind of a short period of time. So current staff were assigned to report under divisional directors or under new managers in a way that was thought to be the best approach in the short term. After I came on board, I had several conversations, meetings, had feedback loops with staff and with our labor partners, and identified a new organizational structure that we felt was best approach to move forward in the long term. That organizational structure additionally identified that we had a need for additional in-person support at Letty Arena, which is one of our largest and most frequented recreation facilities in the city. With that, we envision this is a kind of first step in needing to come back and have additional conversations around that larger organizational structure. And so we have identified there are several other areas where we come back and have the similar to what DFA did in kind of looking at what work is being assigned in each of the areas in order to make sure that we are fairly representing workload on all of our personnel. But we again have seen substantial savings in the department, particularly in recreation. We reviewed revenues comparative to the expenses. We recognize this as an opportunity for additional revenue generation, additional use of Letty as a physical space for recreation, and additional opportunity for staff morale, recognizing that staff having adequate management, supervision, and support, and setting that structure and that vision for what we're doing as an organization and as individual units. The request that we have before you is revenue neutral. So we have identified savings inside of our department in order to fund this request. And that would be continued into the next budget cycles as well as the current cycle for fiscal year 25-26. With that, I would open it up to any questions that you may have.
Before we go to the questions, and I did ask Phil to really, as he came in and really assessed our department, especially after the changes, like where the potential was within this department to really grow, to your point, Council Carpenter, around revenue. And Letty has really been an underperforming asset. Hopefully that is said with as much respect to the folks who've been really working very hard to keep it operational. And I think there's just great potential, as Phil was outlining, and this helps us to really put our best foot forward to make sure that we're utilizing our assets to the fullest of their potential, especially where there can be revenue generated for this city. And I look forward to bringing with Phil the rest of the full department's full review, which Phil and his team have been hard working on over the last several months with the team to really make sure that the department has been stabilized and we're clear about the roles and responsibilities, and some really thoughtful reorganization of staff post the RIFs and the restructuring that we had to do last year. So now open to questions or comments. Councilor.
Thank you. I'm just wondering how close this is to when we ripped some positions last year, and is this, I'm looking through the job description and I don't recall what the job descriptions were for those that. Is this essentially sort of like one of the positions we ripped, or is it something different?
It is a different position, and it's thank you for that question. We very thoughtfully looked at the position as outlined and made sure intentionally that there was not any potential overlap with the positions that were reduced in the RIF process, and with our HR staff, and make sure that we met with our attorneys to ensure that there was a differentiation between the positions. As you notice in the org chart, the positions that report to me directly as the department head, we have division directors, of which the position was a division director. Now we have the recreation manager positions reporting directly to me. So I will, as the department head, be providing the support and management to individuals, those roles that previously had reported to a division director.
And this is, it even says in the job description, but it's essentially a specific position.
So it's Letty, yeah, so I really see it as a community hub at Letty, so not only Letty physically, the building, but the park and kind of the activities that are happening in and around the facility, in addition to managing the sports functions of the department. So they will serve in that kind of citywide hub of recreational programming for sports and athletics, and really seeing Letty as that sports and athletics hub for the recreation division.
Councilor Carpenter?
I guess I'm wondering why we're doing this now, 2 months before we decide on the budget. You know, I don't know what we're talking about, whether there's more need to reduce in Parks and Rec. And I thought doubting the need necessarily for the position, but I'm struggling with, you know, shouldn't we look this more as a whole? And, you know, are there other things that could be balanced? I know it's revenue neutral this year, but may not be next year.
Yeah.
And, you know, we took some heavy cuts, and again, as I said earlier, Parks and Recs and BCA are the two, you know, outside public safety are two bigger users where bluntly, there's probably more discretion in what we do or we don't do. I like the idea of beefing up the use of Letty Park, for lack of a better way to say that. But I'm just curious why approve this position kind of now and not in the context. And, you know I've talked a little bit to Phil about, you know, adult programming, like where's that in the mix? So there's a lot of things happening around them. This just seems out of context a little bit.
Well, I'm gonna start if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So there's two primary reasons. One, I spoke to a little bit with just making sure that we have an asset that's really reaching its full potential. That's a critical part for us, to everything we were just saying before around generating more revenue out of this department in ways that have been underutilized and under-supported in ways that staff can actually help to really accelerate that. So that's one big piece. Of course, this is a creation of a position that's not filled right now that we think is a strategic investment in this department to do that activation I was mentioning. If you decide as council, when we give the budget over this, and we can talk about the hiring plan and the schedule, we're very close to presenting more detailed information to the full council within a couple of weeks. And you'll see how this all fits together. The other piece about it that Phil's been alluding to is very important, because we talked about this during the reorganization last July or so, and the budgeting process going into July, how important it was to get to the other side of the reorganization and then have a stabilized plan and to report back to all of you. So this is, you know, my expectation that the three most impacted departments, DFA, now Parks, Recreation, Waterfront, and then CEDO next, really come back and show not only accountable of the city, how we have restructured in a thoughtful and sustainable way. And there is a level of urgency because it's been several months while we're also hiring a new director for this department to bring that forward, to show how we rethought within our means, how that will look for all of the different divisions within this department. So that's coming soon to our finance for you in April, and it will these pieces will all make sense as we further ourselves in the budgeting process.
If we approve this tonight, what do we just approve relative to the budget?
Well, it allows us to again create a position that we can make a solid assumption that we will have the revenues that Phil, I'm sure, has put into the lines that I've encouraged BCA, Parks, DPI is another fee generating department. And this is a piece. Without this would make this a less of a confident assumption in those numbers that we will be presenting in my budget.
Okay. This is on Letty. There's been this discussion about charging for parking there, and I'm curious, maybe you're gonna come up with that, but it's been on, it's been off.
I have not had, to this point in my onboarding process, we've not had conversations around charging for parking any specifically, but I think to the mayor's point, like we're actively looking at revenue generating and balancing access with revenues in the department. So I think everything's on the table. It's just a point of being thoughtful and strategic in how we're approaching that.
That wasn't in my onboarding process either, because actually I haven't heard that idea before, but we are, as I've said to all counselors as we put this budget together, if these are ideas that, you know, doesn't matter that
I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I definitely been talking
council
about.
represents that part.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a huge parking lot.
Yeah.
It gets a lot of use by outside citizens.
Mhm.
And I guess if we're gonna rent it, so to speak, a little more, so I just think that needs to be part of the conversation. The other thing, which I'll just want to find a little bit about is, I encourage more active use of levy, but as an asset in my district, I am concerned about nighttime use and security, and for instance, we spent a lot of money putting a gate on, and we don't use it. Why don't we use it? Well, we don't have staff to shut it at night. Well, then that means anybody can use the parking lot at night. So I think as you expand your use of activities, which I basically really support, along with that, it's gonna have to be security or plans, particularly at night. You know, the use of that road, which happens to be very narrow, and it is what it is. We haven't got anything different, but we've got to think about that, and then the activity that encourages at night.
Thank you, Counselor. Any other comments or questions on this item, Counselor Travers?
No, thank you, Mayor. And let me say at the outset, I'm fully supportive of this. I very much appreciate your bringing it before the board, support of council as well. Phil, one of the reasons I was really excited about your appointment is because of your background in recreation and our knowing that at the time of your appointment, that this was an area of parks that, from my perspective, needed some shoring up. Unfortunately, it's also from my perspective, one of the reasons it needed shoring up was because of actions before your time, but nonetheless actions that we took in the last year or two. And I just, before voting on this, just need to name some frustration around all that. Again, before your time here, nothing you could have done with respect to it, but frustration nonetheless. I think as we were going through the budget process a year ago, there were a number of us on the council who were concerned about the impact there would be on recreation programming by eliminating a number of the roles in this area. And it was named at the time, and there were efforts by many of us on the council to maintain that funding, including towards maintaining FTE positions within that department. I think a number of us knew the impact it would have on recreation programming, both for kids and adults in our community. I think many of us knew the impact it would likely have on staff morale. And I think we also knew the impact that it was going to have on revenue. Now, one of the main reasons why Lake Park has been an underperforming asset over the course of the past year is because we eliminated the superintendent of recreation facilities, the position that was responsible for rink management. So to the extent it's been an underperforming revenue source, it's again been because of our own actions, I think actions that were taken with some consequences that should have been known at the time. I think the other thing that I want to name is there were some really treasured city staff that were caught up in that. And I want to name a couple of them because I want them to know if they're tuning in that their work for the city is still going with notice. Gary Rogers worked for many years in our recreation department. Melissa Kay as well, who was the aforementioned superintendent of recreation facilities, worked here for many years, and they were really treasured staff members. Where I believe, in all likelihood, at least in part, some of the morale issues have been around losing a number of those treasured individuals. And I think even they at the time recognized that both of them in management level positions was likely unsustainable as we were moving through this budgeting process. And I think if you were to look them up to a truth detector a year ago, and as we were going through that process, I think they probably would have thought that as we got through that it would end up not with two management positions anymore, a big management position maybe there'd be something else, or maybe there would just be one position, right? I think there was a lot of surprise across the board when both of those positions were subject to reduction, and we heard that. These individuals came and spoke to this board about a year ago. And I appreciate that this is a different job description, but if I'm Gary, if I'm Melissa, right, I'm looking at this job description and thinking, gosh, this is what we should have done a year ago. And if I'm them, I'm sitting with a lot of frustration. And if I'm the department, I'm sitting with a lot of frustration. And I'm giving name to that frustration as well. I really appreciate you and the team digging in here and putting the work in now, but I wish we'd done this a year ago. And you know, to the extent folks like Gary, Melissa, or others are interested in coming back to the city, I hope they'll consider applying for this opening because they did a lot of good work for Burlington. And I'm glad that we're heading in this direction.
Thank you.
I'm just gonna note, I would just caution counselors around commenting on personnel decisions that were made. And just knowing about legal liability around things that may not be resolved yet with things that are impacted from last year. So just a friendly reminder to that. And if people have further discussions, they can of course consult with the city attorney or our HR director on some of those details confidentially, but I just want to caution comments on prior decisions. And that were resulting of the budget that we all worked on together. But I also just want to say that with Letty, and I don't have these numbers at my fingertips, but it's certainly something that Phil and the team can present, and the division directors who helped in the transition certainly did a deep dive into Letty. It is not just the prior year where there's been underperformance for Letty, and there's a lot of reasons for that, including decisions and not too recent, but prior to me around extending ice time throughout the summer. That takes quite the expense to maintain, and being able to fully activate that resource, that asset is something that the city has not paid attention to prior to just the last year. So I just want to widen our scope as we talk about and really grapple with where we can be doing more with this important department, and also acknowledging that last year this particular department was one of the hardest ones to balance and to make sure it was part of the overall. As we looked at closing last year's structural budget gap, this one was one of the harder budgets to grapple with. So they were very tough decisions. Nothing was easy, and I just really want to make sure that we bring ourselves back to those really hard decisions that we all were part of last year. Other comments or questions for Phil on this item before we move? We have two more items before. I'm just mindful of what's next. Okay, then is there a motion on this item?
Move to take the action on CEDO.
Thank you, Councilor Travers. Is there a second? Second by Councilor Barlow. Thank you. Any discussion on this before we vote? And seeing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Motion carries unanimously. Phil, thank you.
Thank you.
can check off your bingo card. I'm looking forward to that especially.
Thank you.
Item 5.3 is our next item. It's the creation of 2 new CEDO positions within our Community Justice Center. And somewhere. Rachel Jolly, our director for the CJC, is here. Item, thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. As the memo tried to lay out the context that we're looking at, due to a new law last year called Act 180, which was about the expansion of restorative justice throughout the state and changing the management and pre-charge referrals, that has resulted in the Attorney General's office, our primary funder for all court diversion and pretrial services that the CJC has offered. They have given a grace year this fiscal 26 year by giving contracts to 3 other Chittenden County CJCs this fiscal year, but that's coming to an end on June 30th. So the contract for that pre-charge diversion work that happens in these other towns doesn't officially start until July 1st. They've amended our contract this current year so that we could hire early, so that we could have as smooth as possible transition starting July 1st. So the idea is that upon your approval, city council's approval in mid-April, we'd be able to post right away so that hiring could take place right away. But these are 100% funded positions by the contract, and while we don't have a contract yet for fiscal year 27, these contracts are very sustainable, and the intention, as the director of court diversion and pretrial services at the AGO has just put in writing to all the directors today, You're looking actually at a 3% increase, as they have done every year, under the governor's budget, so assuming that's approved, we'd be looking at a 3% increase of our current contract for fiscal year 27, just due to cost of living increases. So these two position creation, these two new positions would be very similar to existing positions, but just are being brought on to cover the added capacity of more additional pre-charge referrals.
Rachel. Questions or comments from the board? Councilor Carpenter.
Just you mentioned the 3% increase generally for your overall, is that covering all your costs or?
Yeah, I mean, for that contract, and
Yeah.
like we have a diverse array of contracts to diverse services, so some of our program services are underfunded, but it covers the costs of our AGO portfolio.
Anything else? Is there a motion? Councilor Barlow?
To approve and recommend that the city council approve the creation of 2 re-entry coordinator positions within CEDO and regular full-time.
Thank you, Councilor Barlow. Is there a second? Second by Councilor Carpenter. Thank you. Any further discussion before we vote? Seeing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. On to our last deliberative item, item 5.4, which is an award of College Street Outfall and Stormwater Separation Feasibility Study contract for Water Resources Division under the Department of Public Works. Hello, team. Welcome.
Hi, Ashley Valenti, Water Resources Engineer. We are looking to execute a contract with Hoyle Tanner to perform a feasibility study to inspect opportunities throughout the downtown corridor, mostly College Street, Battery Street, Main Street, and even Cherry Street, for additional sewer and stormwater separation projects, water quality improvements at College Street Outfall, which could also part of that is we are looking at the feasibility of also extending that outfall further into the lake to reduce sediment deposit right there at the Spirit of Ethan Allen where this discharge location is. So we are looking at all of these opportunities to decrease the amount of stormwater that is entering our combined collection system and thus getting to our treatment facilities. And so it'll provide more capacity throughout this network and the city in general to allow us to grow both in developments as well as just overall health of our system.
Succinct summary, Ashley. Thank you for that. Anything from our division director who's online?
Yes, hi all. The majority of the work we believe will be funded. We have a remaining combined sewer overflow ARPA grants, and we're trying to spend down that money before the deadline at the end of the year. And so our plan here is to hopefully get us through as much of this project as possible with those ARPA grants. And then at that point, we'll see how much is remaining, and we may need to return to you with a request for a small loan, a planning loan from the SRF to cover the balance of it, or depending after confirmation of our fund balance, we may choose to maybe just do it either through our FY27 budget or repurposing fund balance. The number, I guess I just want to address, the elephant in the room. The number it's a large number for a planning study. It's because sewer separation, when we've already done so much sewer separation, we've done all the easy sewer separation. The remaining projects are very, very complicated and require a lot of effort to even figure out if they are feasible. So that's why when Ashley and I reviewed the scope of work and the detail in the scope of work, this number, while it is a large number, seems reasonable for all of the stones that have to be turned in order to figure out if this is a possibility, especially the figuring out about the outfall extension, which would be the only way we would feel comfortable introducing additional stormwater into the network.
Questions or comments from the board? Councilor Carpenter.
More planning is always good. But given where we're at, I just see a large number on extending that outfall. And given where we're at, we've had a conversation about debt service, and I just want to kind of get a sense on the timing. If we do this now, but. And it's, you know, I don't know if you have a number. 5 million, 10 million, give a number. Will we have that amount of money available? And will the planning study still be fresh enough to match up with, because we're gonna have to pay down some debt service. If we're in $10 million range, I don't know what. range.
Yeah, I mean, it's really gonna be dependent on,
Yeah.
so part of the memo actually touches on, we have a pause phase at the 60% study design
Yeah.
of this to determine the feasibility of any of these things. It's really gonna be dependent, as Megan said, on that ability to extend that outfall
Yeah.
as adding more stormwater into that location, which is already, we spend money on dredging there every other year, give or take. So we have like a pause phase there, but in terms of what type of projects we can or can't do. And this feasibility study is gonna be a wide breadth, be able to maybe pick off some smaller things here or there that can drastically improve our system without doing maybe these large 10, $20 million projects that you are
And the, one of the,
the finances.
yes. The finances, but also one of the reasons we need to figure out if it's even feasible, because we have multiple projects like Cherry Street, like Lower Main, where we need to see what our future could be to decide if we're going to potentially spend more money during those projects to put in a whole separate stormwater pipe. If we run this to ground and it's like no go, then we kind of know that it's not worth expending additional effort in some of those other projects. I think as far as like paying this loan back, we don't usually have to pay the loan back until it converts into a construction project. So it kind of buys us, you know, potentially 5, 6, 7 years before we're looking at having to pay the debt service. And we would be able to look at our ability to do so. But a lot of it is about having that information now so we can make better decisions on all the projects that are popping up in this corridor.
Other questions or comments on this item? Councilor Travers.
Yeah, perhaps a somewhat related question on what Councilor Carpenter was saying here, just to the extent there's ARPA funds involved here, were these originally part of an ARPA grant from the state, or was it part of the city's municipal allocation of ARPA funds?
It is directly state ARPA money that was set aside for combined sewer communities. So this money cannot be spent on any other effort other than something that relates to reductions of stormwater into the combined sewer system.
Okay, and I think this is a rhetorical question, but I'll just confirm it. I know that as we've been talking about the budget and the different proposals the mayor's office put together with respect to addressing the gap, that a part of it has looked towards prior one-time money, including ARPA funds. My understanding, though, is that what that is sort of the scraping together of unused municipal ARPA funds that were previously allocated to city projects and could be repurposed for other aspects of the municipal budget now, and that we're not referring to these monies. So to the extent we're talking about using $200,000, Moore, to your point, it can only be used for this purpose and has not otherwise been cited in budget presentations as monies to address the budget gap. Is that right?
Correct. I would even like to potentially repurpose some of this money for other water resources things, and I can't because it's so narrowly defined what it can be used for. We've been as creative as we can with the state on what we've used it to pay for, even elements of our wastewater treatment plant upgrade that relate to wet weather treatment, but it is very much carved out only for these purposes and can't be repurposed in any way.
Okay, thank you.
Appreciate the question. It's helpful to define what is allowable for general fund purposes versus not for ARPA. Line down. Councilor.
Yes, and my question's more about like, not about how we're spending this money, because I support the separation of sewer storm. But more about like what this will actually mean. So you would map to see where the sewer and the stormwater are.
Yep,
About
so,
what's feeding the outfall.
so right now we actually have that mapped already. It's actually an open source. What this would actually do is so we have what's called the hydraulic model. So it actually would perform hydraulic models on, and sewer separation is removing stormwater from the collection system. So it would actually put it into its own dedicated pipe so that it's not in our wastewater system. So that way it actually free up capacity within our wastewater collection system. So our pipes that would solely be for wastewater, and then we'd have sole pipes specifically for stormwater. And so that stormwater then would be directed towards the outfall rather than being combined with our wastewater that feeds to our main collection plant. So we use our hydraulic model to run scenarios, range scenarios, and it tells us how our pipes react to those specific styles of rain vents. We're doing this in other areas of the city, specifically like the Pine Street corridor is one of our big areas that we're doing this. So this is a further expansion of that into this downtown corridor.
The unique thing is this is one of the only locations where we have a separate stormwater outfall that already exists that we can put water that is currently in the combined sewer system, potentially capture it and put it into a separate stormwater outfall. We don't have that opportunity in places like the Pine Street corridor. So that there's an outfall that already exists and we're looking at, could we add more water to it? Water that is currently going in the combined sewer and going to the plant.
Which is why you'd want to extend the outfall pipe so that it.
Yeah, so that we would
Yes.
have so much sediment issues and it would, further bring it out into the lake.
That's helpful.
Any other questions or comments? Is there a motion? Councilor Carpenter.
I would move the motion on, as posted on City Clerk.
Great, thank you very much, Councilor Carpenter. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Councilor Barlow. Any further discussion before we vote? Seeing none, all in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you very much.
Megan.
Thank
And
you.
no further deliberative items. I will adjourn the Board of Finance at 5:40 p.m. Thank you.